Dr. Sarah Mitchell had seen her share of alien species during 5 years aboard the research vessel Concordia, but the Nithra still made her catch her breath. Not from fear, though their 7-foot frames and predatory grace certainly commanded respect, but from the sheer artistry of their scarification patterns. Traditional Nithra warriors wore their battle stories across their skin like living tapestries, each mark precisely placed according to ancient ceremonial significance. The woman sitting alone in the cultural center, however, was different. Sarah approached cautiously, tablet in hand and professional curiosity winning over social awkwardness. The Nithra's scars were chaotic, lacking the geometric precision typical of her species. They crossed her deep blue skin in jagged lines that spoke of violence rather than ceremony, creating patterns that seemed more like abstract art than military decoration. "Dr. Kira, I presume?" Sarah extended her hand in the human greeting gesture, then remembered Nithra customs and shifted to the respectful nod. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, Xenoanthropology Department." Kira looked up from the cultural database she'd been studying, golden eyes taking Sarah's measure with unsettling intensity. "Dr. Mitchell. Your reputation precedes you. I've read your work on cross-species trauma adaptation." "Thank you. And I have to say, you have quite the impressive collection of battle stories there." Sarah gestured toward Kira's scarred arms with what she hoped was professional admiration. "I'd love to hear about the cultural significance of some of those patterns when we have time." The silence that followed was so profound that Sarah could hear the ship's life support systems humming in the background. Kira's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her golden eyes, a flicker of something that might have been pain, quickly replaced by careful neutrality. "Battle stories," Kira repeated softly, her voice carrying an accent that made each word sound deliberately chosen. "Is that what humans see when they look at scars?" Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to assume. Traditional Nithra scarification is ceremonial, representing significant victories and achievements. I thought. You thought correctly about traditional scarification." Kira's voice was gentle, but there was something underneath it that made Sarah want to sit down, to listen more carefully. "These, however, are not traditional." "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have." "No, please. Your assumption is logical based on your training." Kira gestured to the chair across from her. "May I share something with you, Dr. Mitchell? Something that might interest you from a research perspective?" Sarah sat, tablet forgotten, sensing that whatever came next would be important in ways she couldn't yet understand. "These scars," Kira continued, tracing one of the jagged lines across her forearm, "are not from glorious battles or ceremonial rites. They are from 3 years of captivity when I was barely past childhood, taken by slavers who specialized in capturing young Nithra for their exotic value." Sarah's breath caught. "Kira, I'm so sorry, I had no idea." "Of course not. How could you? But here is what might interest you as a researcher." Kira leaned forward slightly, and Sarah was struck by the intelligence in those golden eyes, the careful way she spoke as if each word was being weighed and measured. "In Nithra society, we have 2 types of scars. Those earned through choice, and those inflicted by circumstance. Mine are the second type, which makes me what we call unmarked, despite being covered in marks." "Unmarked. Uncategorizable. Neither hero nor victim in traditional terms. We survived something that wasn't supposed to happen to us, and our society struggles with how to honor that survival." Kira's laugh was dry, almost amused. "Your comment about battle stories was actually quite refreshing. Most humans either stare in horror or pretend not to notice at all." Sarah found herself leaning forward, fascinated despite her embarrassment. "Is that why you volunteered for this cultural exchange?" "Partially. I study cross-species approaches to trauma and recovery. I'm curious about how different civilizations interpret physical evidence of survival." Kira tilted her head, studying Sarah with renewed interest. "You called them battle stories. What did you see when you looked at them?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Honestly, I saw someone who'd lived through things worth remembering. Someone who wore their experiences openly instead of hiding them. Interesting. Kira's expression softened slightly. Most of my own people see them as evidence of weakness, proof that I was captured rather than dying honorably in battle. That's ridiculous, Sarah said before she could stop herself. Is it? What do humans typically do with scars? We try to minimize them. Cosmetic surgery, scar reduction treatments. Most people see them as damage to be fixed. Sarah paused, realizing the implications of her earlier comment. I think I may have made some assumptions about Nithra culture that weren't entirely accurate. Your assumptions were based on limited data about ceremonial scarification. A reasonable hypothesis. Kira's voice carried what might have been approval. But perhaps this gives us both something to study. How so? You assumed my scars were chosen, worn with pride, representing victories. I've spent years assuming they could only represent shame and violation. Kira traced another line across her arm, this one crossing her shoulder in a way that suggested it had been deliberately inflicted to cause maximum pain. What if there's a third interpretation we're both missing? Sarah stared at her, this tall, imposing figure who spoke of trauma with scientific detachment while revealing depths of pain that made Sarah's chest tight with empathy. What kind of third interpretation? That's what I hope to discover during this exchange. Kira stood, her full height making Sarah crane her neck to maintain eye contact. Dr. Mitchell, would you be interested in collaborating on some research? I think our different perspectives might yield interesting results. Sarah spent the next morning buried in Nithra cultural databases, trying to understand the complex social structures surrounding scarification. What she found made her conversation with Kira even more poignant. Traditional Nithra society was built around the concept of marked achievement. Each scar represented a specific accomplishment, earned through combat, survival challenges, or ceremonial rites of passage. The patterns were deliberate, artistic, telling coherent stories that other Nithra could read like biographical text. Kira's scars told no such story. Fascinating reading, came Kira's voice from behind her. Sarah spun around in her chair to find Kira observing her with that same analytical intensity, this time carrying 2 cups of something that smelled like spiced tea. I brought caffeine. I've learned that humans require it for optimal cognitive function. Kira settled into the chair across from Sarah's workstation. Though I confess I find your dependence on stimulants puzzling. Says the member of a species that can go 3 days without sleep during battle conditions. Sarah accepted the cup gratefully. Thank you. And yes, fascinating reading, though I feel like I'm missing some crucial context. Which context specifically? The social implications of being unmarked. The database entries are fairly clinical, but I get the sense there's more to it than ceremonial categorization. Kira was quiet for a moment, sipping her tea while golden eyes focused on something beyond the viewport. Have you ever been in a situation where everyone around you knew exactly who they were supposed to be, but you didn't fit any of the available categories? Sarah thought about her own struggles as one of the few xenoanthropologists who'd never quite fit into either pure research or field applications. Actually, yes. Then you understand the basics. Nithra society functions on clear identity markers. Warriors, scholars, artisans, leaders, each with specific scarification patterns that announce your role to anyone who looks at you. Kira gestured to her chaotic markings. These announce nothing except that something happened to me that wasn't supposed to happen. But you survived. Doesn't that count for something? That's what I'm trying to determine. 3 years in captivity, followed by 2 years of recovery, followed by 6 years of trying to figure out where I fit in a society built around chosen achievements. Kira's smile was rueful. Which is why I'm here, studying how other species handle individuals who don't fit standard categories. Sarah leaned forward, professional curiosity mixing with personal interest. What have you learned so far? Humans are remarkably adaptable to categorical ambiguity. Your species seems comfortable with individuals who exist between traditional definitions. Kira traced one of her scars absently. Most Nithra would have introduced themselves with their achievement markers. I am Kira, daughter of the Mountain Clan, marked for strategic brilliance in the Battle of Three Moons. Instead, I find myself saying I am Kira, survivor of circumstances we don't discuss. Is that how you see yourself? As defined by what happened to you? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Kira set down her cup, studying Sarah with renewed focus. Yesterday, you called my scars, battle stories. What specifically did you see that made you say that? Sarah considered the question carefully. Honestly, I saw complexity. The patterns were intricate, obviously significant, covering enough area to suggest they were important rather than accidental. I assumed they were ceremonial because they were so comprehensive. Comprehensive. Kira repeated the word thoughtfully. An interesting choice. Most people who know the truth use words like extensive or severe. Well, they are extensive. But they're also. Sarah hesitated, trying to articulate something she'd only half-consciously observed. They're not random. Even without ceremonial significance, there's a kind of logic to them. Kira went very still. Explain. The ones on your arms follow muscle lines, like whoever made them understood anatomy. The patterns on your shoulders seem designed to avoid major nerve clusters. Even in torture, there was some kind of method. Sarah stopped, horrified at her own clinical detachment. God, I'm sorry, I'm talking about your trauma like it's a research specimen. No, please continue. This is exactly the kind of perspective I need. Kira leaned forward intently. What else do you see? I see. Sarah forced herself to look directly at Kira's scars, seeing them not as evidence of suffering but as information to be analyzed. I see someone who healed remarkably well. The scar tissue formation is clean, suggesting good medical care during recovery. I see marks that could have been fatal but weren't, which suggests either luck or someone who fought very hard to survive. Someone who fought, Kira repeated softly. Someone who made choices, even under impossible circumstances. Someone who came back from something that was designed to break them. Sarah met Kira's eyes directly. I see a warrior who fought a different kind of battle than the ones your people traditionally honor. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of recognition. When Kira finally spoke, her voice carried something Sarah hadn't heard before, hope. In all my research into cross-species trauma response, I've never encountered that interpretation. Because most species either see scars as damage to be hidden or as deliberate choices to be honored. But yours. Sarah gestured carefully toward Kira's arms. Yours are something else entirely. They're evidence of survival skills your society doesn't have categories for. Survival skills. You said you were captured as a child. You survived 3 years in conditions designed to break adult warriors. You escaped or were rescued. You recovered enough to become a researcher capable of objective analysis of your own trauma. Sarah counted off the points on her fingers. Those aren't the achievements of a victim, Kira. Those are the achievements of someone who refused to be broken. Kira stared at her for a long moment, then began to laugh, not the bitter sound from yesterday, but something warmer, more genuinely amused. Dr. Mitchell, has anyone ever told you that you have a remarkable talent for reframing perspectives? Occupational hazard of xenoanthropology. We specialize in seeing familiar things from unfamiliar angles. Sarah smiled back. Though I have to admit, this conversation is changing how I think about a lot of things. Such as the assumption that scars automatically represent either shame or pride. Maybe some scars represent something more complex, evidence of a story that's still being written. Kira's expression grew thoughtful. A story still being written. I like that. She stood, moving to the viewport where stars streamed past in the blue shift of faster-than-light travel. Dr. Mitchell, would you be interested in co-authoring a paper on alternative frameworks for understanding trauma markers in cross-species contexts? Absolutely. Though I should warn you, my approach tends to be somewhat unconventional. I'm counting on it. Kira turned back with a smile that transformed her entire face. After all, the distress signal came during what should have been a routine research day. Sarah was reviewing preliminary data from her collaboration with Kira when the ship's emergency klaxons began their urgent wail. All senior staff to emergency stations, came Captain Torres' voice over the intercom. We have a priority rescue situation. Sarah found the briefing room buzzing with controlled chaos. The main display showed a damaged transport vessel, its hull scarred by weapon fire and what appeared to be makeshift repairs. Rescued trafficking victims, Torres explained tersely. Mix of species, unknown number of survivors. The transport managed to escape their captors, but they're in bad shape. Medical and psychological support will be critical. Dr. Harrison from the medical bay was already organizing triage protocols when Sarah noticed Kira enter the briefing room. The Nithra's usual composed demeanor had shifted into something more alert, predatory in a way that made several officers unconsciously step back. What's the situation? Kira asked, her voice carrying an authority Sarah hadn't heard before. Mixed species trafficking victims, recently escaped. We're preparing rescue and support protocols. Torres glanced at Kira with professional respect. Your expertise in trauma response could be valuable here. Sarah watched as something changed in Kira's posture, not fear or distress, but a kind of focused intensity that transformed her from researcher to something much more dangerous. How long were they held? Kira asked. Unknown. Some may have been in captivity for years. Psychological state. Presumed severe trauma, possible conditioning, unknown level of trust capacity. Dr. Harrison consulted his notes. We'll need to approach them very carefully. Kira nodded grimly. I'd like to volunteer for the initial contact team. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Kira, are you sure that's? Dr. Mitchell, survivors of trafficking respond differently to contact from people who share their experiences. Kira's golden eyes met hers with steady determination. I know what it feels like to be rescued and not know if the rescue is real. 6 hours later, Sarah stood in the observation deck watching the rescue operation unfold. The transport vessel had docked successfully, but the real work was just beginning. Through the monitoring feeds, she could see the survivors, a dozen beings from at least 6 different species, all showing the telltale signs of long-term captivity and abuse. And Kira was with them. Sarah had expected to see the composed researcher or perhaps the determined warrior she'd glimpsed in the briefing room. Instead, she watched Kira transform into something else entirely. Someone gentle yet unquestionably strong, speaking in soft tones to a cluster of survivors who seemed to recognize something in her scarred appearance. She's remarkable, said Dr. Harrison, joining Sarah at the observation window. Look how they're responding to her. It was true. The survivors, who had been cowering from the medical team and security officers, were gradually moving closer to Kira. A young cerulean female, her blue scales dull from malnutrition, was actually touching one of Kira's scarred arms while Kira spoke to her in what appeared to be her native language. She speaks cerulean? Sarah asked. Apparently she speaks 7 languages, all learned during her captivity, Harrison replied. She's been working with each species group, explaining the rescue process, assuring them they're safe. Sarah watched as Kira knelt beside a small Eltarian child, her imposing height suddenly irrelevant as she became someone safe and understanding. The child pointed to Kira's scars, and Kira nodded, rolling up her sleeve to show more of the chaotic patterns. What is she telling them? Sarah whispered. Through the intercom, they could hear fragments of Kira's voice as she switched between languages, but the tone was unmistakable, patient, gentle, absolutely certain. She's telling them about survival, came Torres' voice from behind them. The captain had joined them at the observation deck, his expression thoughtful. About how scars can be proof that someone fought to live, that they refused to give up. How do you know that? Because I asked her, before she went in there. Torres watched as another survivor, this one a Nithra male who looked barely older than Kira had been when she was taken, approached her hesitantly. She said the hardest part of being rescued is believing that it's real, that it's permanent. She said sometimes seeing someone else's survival scars helps convince you that escape is possible. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she watched the interaction. The male Nithra was pointing to his own scars, fresher, more recent than Kira's. She was nodding, touching her own marks in what appeared to be comparison, explanation, reassurance. She's showing them that survival has a future tense, Sarah realized. Exactly. Torres smiled grimly. She volunteered for this because she knew something we couldn't, that sometimes the best rescue comes from someone who's already made the journey back. The operation continued for another 4 hours. Sarah watched as Kira worked tirelessly, moving between groups of survivors, translating not just languages but experiences. She saw her help organize sleeping arrangements, explain medical procedures, and somehow convince beings who had every reason to distrust authority that they were genuinely safe. When Kira finally emerged from the survivor quarters, she looked exhausted but satisfied. Her usually perfect posture had relaxed into something more approachable, and her golden eyes held a warmth Sarah was beginning to recognize. How did it go? Sarah asked as they walked toward the research section together. Better than I expected. They're beginning to believe the rescue is real. Kira paused, looking back toward the survivor quarters. Do you know what the hardest part is, after escape? What? Figuring out who you are when you're not just trying to survive anymore. When you have choices again. Kira's voice was thoughtful. I told them something today that I'd never articulated before. Which was? That scars aren't just evidence of what happened to you. They're evidence that you decided to keep living despite what happened to you. Kira looked down at her own arms, the chaotic patterns catching the corridor lighting. Every day I chose not to give up, my body was making marks to remember that choice. Sarah felt something shift in her understanding. Not just of Kira, but of survival itself. You're seeing them differently now. I'm seeing them as you saw them yesterday. As evidence of battles fought and won, even if they weren't the battles I would have chosen. Kira smiled, and for the first time since Sarah had met her, it was completely without reservation. Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. For what? For helping me realize that sometimes the bravest warriors are the ones who refuse to stop fighting, even when the enemy is despair. As they continued down the corridor, Sarah found herself looking at Kira with new eyes, seeing not just the scars, but the strength that had created them, the daily choice to survive that each mark represented, and the warrior who had learned to turn her deepest wounds into a source of healing for others. 3 days after the rescue, Sarah found Kira in the ship's observation lounge at 0300 hours, staring out at the star field with an expression of deep contemplation. The survivors were settled now, beginning the long process of psychological recovery, but Kira seemed to be processing something else entirely. Can't sleep either? Sarah asked, settling into the chair beside her. Sleep has been elusive recently. Kira's voice carried a thoughtfulness that hadn't been there before the rescue. I've been thinking about our conversation from yesterday. About scars waiting for someone brave enough to see beauty in them. Sarah remembered the moment. It had been during one of their research sessions, when Kira had made an offhand comment that had stopped Sarah cold. You said that each scar had waited for someone to see beauty in it. I've been wondering what you meant. Kira was quiet for a long moment, her golden eyes reflecting the starlight streaming through the viewport. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of years of careful thought. When I first returned to Nithra society after my rescue, I spent considerable time with healers and counselors. They focused on helping me process what had been done to me, how to integrate the trauma, how to move forward despite the damage. She traced one of the scars along her forearm absently. But none of them ever suggested that what had been done to me might have created something valuable. Valuable how? You saw it during the rescue operation. The survivors trusted me because I carried visible evidence of shared experience. My scars became a language they could read, a reassurance that survival was possible. Kira turned to face Sarah directly. For 6 years, I've seen these marks as evidence of victimization. But watching those survivors respond to me, I realized they might be something else entirely. Sarah leaned forward, sensing that this conversation was approaching something crucial. What else might they be? Maps. Kira's voice grew stronger, more certain. Each mark represents a moment when I chose to continue living instead of giving up. They're not just evidence of what was done to me, they're evidence of what I did in response. Which was? Survive. Resist. Refuse to be broken. Kira stood, moving to the viewport where she pressed her palms against the cool metal frame. The beings who held me were methodical in their cruelty. Each scar was intended to destroy some part of my will, to make me more compliant, more easily controlled. Sarah felt her chest tighten with empathy and anger. But it didn't work. No. Because every time they tried to break something in me, I found a way to protect what mattered most. Kira's reflection in the viewport showed a smile that was both sad and triumphant. They scarred my body, but they couldn't touch the parts of me that made me who I am. Is that what you meant about scars waiting for someone to see beauty in them? Partially. But there's more. Kira returned to her seat, this time turning to face Sarah fully. I've spent years looking for someone who could see these marks as something other than damage. Someone who could look at evidence of the worst thing that ever happened to me and find something worthy of appreciation. Sarah's breath caught as she realized the full weight of what Kira was saying. And did you find that someone? Yes. Kira's golden eyes held Sarah's steadily. You looked at my scars and saw battle stories. You saw evidence of survival, of strength, of choices made under impossible circumstances. You saw beauty in something I'd been taught to hide. The silence that followed was profound, filled with the weight of recognition and possibility. Sarah found herself really looking at Kira. Not just at her scars, but at the person who had transformed trauma into wisdom, pain into healing power for others. Kira, can I tell you something? When I first saw your scars, I didn't just think they were ceremonial battle marks. I thought they were the most complex, most beautiful scarification I'd ever encountered. Sarah chose her words carefully. Not because of what caused them, but because of what they represent, a refusal to surrender that's written across your skin in patterns that are completely unique. Beautiful, Kira repeated softly. Beautiful, Sarah confirmed. Not in spite of their origin, but because of what you made of that origin. You took something meant to destroy you and turned it into a source of strength for yourself and others. Kira's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of something that looked like relief mixed with wonder. In 15 years of recovery, no one has ever called them beautiful. Then they weren't looking hard enough. Sarah reached out tentatively, stopping just short of touching one of the scars along Kira's wrist. May I? Kira nodded, extending her arm. Sarah traced the scar gently with one finger, feeling the raised tissue that told a story of pain transformed into power. This one, Sarah said softly, what's its story? Day 18 of captivity. I tried to escape by picking the lock on my restraints. I failed, and they made sure I'd remember the attempt. Kira's voice was steady, clinical. But I learned how the locking mechanism worked. I used that knowledge 73 days later when I successfully picked a different lock and helped 3 other prisoners escape. Sarah traced another scar, this one crossing Kira's shoulder. And this one? Day 215. I refused to provide information about Nithra military installations. They tried to convince me through pain. Kira's smile was grim. I never gave them the information. 3 installations remained safe because of my silence. Each scar is a victory, Sarah realized. Each scar is a choice. A moment when I decided that living with the mark was preferable to giving up whatever I was protecting. Kira looked down at her arms with something approaching fondness. I've been seeing them as evidence of defeat. But perhaps they're evidence of the opposite. They're evidence that you're the strongest person I've ever met, Sarah said with complete sincerity. Strong enough to survive. Strong enough to heal. Strong enough to help others. Kira met Sarah's eyes. And apparently strong enough to find someone who could see beauty in the worst chapters of my story. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars stream past while something profound settled between them. Sarah found herself seeing not just Kira's scars, but her own assumptions about trauma, survival, and the ways people could transform their deepest wounds into sources of unexpected strength. Sarah, Kira said finally, what made you brave enough to see beauty in these scars? Sarah considered the question carefully. I think it was seeing you, she said honestly. Someone confident enough to wear their survival openly, analytical enough to study their own trauma objectively, and generous enough to use their pain to help others. The scars are just part of that picture, they're not the whole story, but they're an essential chapter. An essential chapter, Kira mused. I like that metaphor. Your scars aren't just marks of survival, Kira. They're marks of choice. Every day you wake up and choose to keep living, to keep helping others, to keep seeing beauty in the universe despite everything you've endured. Sarah's voice grew stronger with conviction. That's not just survival. That's transformation. That's taking something meant to destroy you and making it into a force for healing. Kira was quiet for a long moment, then reached out and took Sarah's hand in both of hers. Her scarred skin was warm, surprisingly soft despite the raised patterns of tissue. I came on this mission to study how other species perceive trauma markers, she said. I thought I was conducting research on cross-species psychology and recovery frameworks. And instead, I learned that the research I really needed to do was on myself. On how I perceive. 6 months after the rescue mission, Sarah stood in a packed auditorium of the Galactic Research Institute, watching Kira deliver the keynote presentation of their collaborative work. The paper they'd co-authored, Reframing Trauma Markers, Beauty, Strength, and Survival Across Species Lines, had generated more academic interest than either of them had expected. Traditional models of trauma recovery focus on returning subjects to their pre-trauma state, Kira was saying, her voice carrying easily through the lecture hall. Our research suggests that this approach may be fundamentally flawed, as it implies that survival necessarily represents damage to be repaired rather than strength to be celebrated. Sarah felt a familiar surge of pride watching Kira command the attention of hundreds of researchers from dozens of species. The transformation over the past months had been remarkable, not because Kira had changed, but because she had learned to see herself as Sarah saw her. Dar. Mitchell and I propose an alternative framework, Kira continued, one that recognizes trauma markers, whether physical, psychological, or cultural, as evidence of resilience rather than damage. Our cross-species study indicates that survivors who learn to view their trauma markers as symbols of strength show significantly improved long-term recovery outcomes. The presentation continued with data from their expanded research, which had grown far beyond their original collaboration. They'd worked with survivors from 18 different species, developing new therapeutic approaches that emphasize strength recognition over damage repair. But Sarah's favorite part came near the end, when Kira shifted from academic analysis to personal testimony. I volunteered for the cultural exchange program that led to this research because I was seeking answers to questions I couldn't articulate, Kira said, her golden eyes finding Sarah in the audience. I thought I was studying how other species perceive trauma markers. What I discovered was that the most important perception to change was my own. She rolled up her sleeves, revealing the scars that had once been sources of shame but had become integral to her identity as both researcher and healer. These marks tell the story of 3 years of captivity, but they also tell the story of 3 years of refusing to surrender. They represent pain inflicted by others, but they also represent choices I made to protect what mattered most to me. Her voice grew stronger. Most importantly, they represent the moment someone looked at them and saw beauty instead of damage. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Sarah barely heard it. She was focused on Kira's expression, confident, radiant, completely at peace with every aspect of her story. After the presentation, they found themselves in the Institute's garden area, finally able to speak privately after hours of post-lecture discussions and networking. "You were incredible up there," Sarah said, settling beside Kira on a bench overlooking the artificial lake. "We were incredible. That research couldn't have happened without your perspective." Kira leaned back, looking more relaxed than Sarah had ever seen her. "Do you realize what we've accomplished? Besides revolutionizing trauma recovery theory across multiple species. Besides that." Kira's smile was mischievous. "We've created a new model for how people can help each other heal, not by fixing damage, but by recognizing strength." Sarah thought about their journey together, from that first awkward comment about battle stories to their current status as recognized experts in cross-species trauma recovery. But more than the professional achievements, she thought about the personal transformation she'd witnessed. "Kira, do you remember what you said about scars waiting for someone brave enough to see beauty in them?" "Of course. I think you had it backward." Kira raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "I think you were the brave one. You were brave enough to show them to someone who might see them differently. You were brave enough to risk changing how you saw yourself." Sarah turned to face her fully. "You didn't need someone else to make your scars beautiful, Kira. You needed someone else to help you see the beauty that was already there." Kira was quiet for a moment, then laughed, the warm, genuine sound that Sarah had learned to love. "Dr. Sarah Mitchell, do you realize you just deconstructed 6 months of our collaborative research in a single observation?" "How so?" "Because you're absolutely right. The beauty was always there. The strength was always there. The value of the survival story was always there." Kira reached for Sarah's hand, their fingers intertwining with practiced ease. What was missing was the perspective to see it. "And now? Now I see it clearly. Every scar, every choice, every moment of refusing to give up, they're all part of the same story. A story about someone who learned to transform pain into purpose, trauma into teaching, survival into service." Sarah squeezed Kira's hand. "What's the next chapter going to be?" "Well, the Institute has offered us a joint research position developing new therapeutic protocols. The Nithra Council wants to implement our findings in their cultural healing practices. And apparently, 3 other species have requested consultation on redesigning their approach to trauma recovery." That's the professional answer. What about the personal answer? Kira's expression grew soft, contemplative. "The personal answer is that I'd like to continue writing that story with someone who helped me learn to see my own narrative as something worth celebrating." "I'd like that too." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the artificial sunset paint colors across the sky that reminded Sarah of the first time she'd really looked at Kira's scars and seen beauty instead of damage. "You know," Sarah said eventually, "I've been thinking about our original research question." "Which was? How different species perceive physical evidence of survival." "We found our answer, but it led to a more interesting question." "What's that?" "How two people can help each other see strength where they once saw weakness. How connection can transform perception. How recognizing beauty in someone else's survival story can help you recognize the beauty in your own." Kira smiled, tracing one of her scars with her free hand, no longer a gesture of self-consciousness, but one of acknowledgement and acceptance. "I think that's the research we'll be doing for the rest of our lives," she said. "Personal research? The best kind. The kind where the hypothesis is that two people can help each other become more themselves, not less. Where the methodology involves daily choices to see strength instead of damage, beauty instead of brokenness." Sarah looked at Kira, brilliant researcher, fierce warrior, gentle healer, and someone who had taught her that the most profound discoveries often came from learning to see familiar things with new eyes. "I love our research," she said simply. I love our partnership, Kira replied. Above them, real stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and Sarah realized that their story, like Kira's scars, was still being written. But now they were writing it together, two researchers who had discovered that the most beautiful findings weren't always in the data, but in the connections formed while searching for understanding. The scars that had once waited for someone brave enough to see beauty in them had become maps to something neither of them had expected to find. A partnership built on mutual recognition of strength, a collaboration that honored both professional excellence and personal growth, and the rare gift of someone who could see the beauty in every chapter of your story, especially the ones you've been afraid to share.